On June 1st, 1921, the Tulsa, Oklahoma neighborhood known as Greenwood was looted and burned to the ground by a white mob. 35 city blocks were destroyed, and 300 people are believed to have lost their lives. 2 days earlier, an encounter between a black man and a white woman in a downtown elevator sparked a confrontation between whites and blacks, which resulted in the destruction of one of the nation's most successful black neighborhoods, famously known as Black Wall Street. As we approached the 100th anniversary of the massacre, we wanted to meet and hear the voices of those who live and work in the Greenwood neighborhood. With that, we present Greenwood Here and Now.
I know you've been a reporter in Tulsa for many, many years, and I want to know sort of what caused you, what was your call to action to maybe want to go report on the Tulsa race massacre?
Well, the call to action was being assigned to it. So this was back in late 1999, and there'd actually, at that time, there was a state race riot commission that had been appointed by, that had been authorized by the legislature, and so we'd been covering that for a couple of years, and the reporter who had been covering it was leaving, and so I was called in and assigned to not only cover that commission, but to start doing my own research and and it with a particular eye to what the local newspapers, how they had covered it back at that time, but also just more general research on the subject.
Yeah, for sure, and sort of when you think of it from that, like obviously, a lot of the archived newspapers definitely helped you out, I'm sure, a ton in your reporting there. And when you look at some of the people that are in this state, even a lot of people don't really know that this even happened. Some people, and when they hear about it for the first time, it's always a shocking thing. How important would you say it is to archive all of this reporting, all of this work, so people know about it in the future?
Well, it's very important to archive as much as possible. Not just about this, but all sorts of newspapers and historical documents. I mean, most newspapers have for many, many years been preserved on microfilm, and now they're being preserved digitally, and so all of that's important. Of course, the key thing there is that they have to be preserved in such a way so that as the technology changes, they're still accessible. And we've kind of moved away from microfilm to digitization, which is in a lot of ways easier to access. Except the thing about microfilm is that it's a pretty low tech way of preserving things. So as time goes along, you're still able to read the microfilm. With the digital preservation, the software and the technology changes, and you run the danger of at some point not being able to read the documents anymore. But for certain, all sorts of documents, and actually what we've seen is a lot of the things related to the race massacre that had been available all along, but they were in hard copies, paper copies. They were in archives in various places, so you had to go to those places and kind of know what you were looking for, or get real lucky to find them. A lot of those things now are available online, and they weren't even 15 or 20 years ago.
Right, and for history's sake, obviously it's very important, and you had to analyze a lot of these pieces. Is there anything that sort of, when you were doing this research, I guess, obviously about the race massacre, that stuck out to you and was like sort of a moment where you were like, "Oh my goodness, what am I getting myself into?" Or this is just a horrible moment right here.
Well, if something's called a riot or a massacre, you have a pretty good idea going in that it's bad. And so, I don't know that there was anything like that. I mean, I knew it was pretty bad to start out with. That had been pretty well established. I think the things that actually affected me the most in terms of my thinking about things was as I expanded my base of information and started reading all these old newspapers and some of the other documents, some and things that weren't even directly related to the massacre was the realization of just how ingrained racism was into every aspect of American society. Because I think we want to try and think that it was, sort of something that a few people did, but a lot of other people were just sort of disinterested bystanders, and that's really not the way it worked. The racism was really ingrained into everything. So this is a pretty horrible thing, because that's why they call it a riot or a massacre. But there were a lot of aspects of day-to-day life that were in some ways more revealing.
Right, and obviously, like with you working at the Tulsa World, you're right there in like right near Greenwood, and it's just a couple minutes drive down the road. In what ways during this process did you get to know the current community of Greenwood, and what do you see from them right now that maybe is there any signs of them going furthering on in a good direction in terms of the community, or what do you see from it now?
Well, of course I did. I mean, that was one of the good things about covering this matter and continuing, in it for over 20 years, was that I did get to meet a lot of people, and I got to meet a lot of people who had different experiences in life and had different perspectives than I did, and so I had to learn to see things from their point of view and understand their perspectives. The world has changed, and Tulsa has changed a lot in the 100 years, or almost 100 years since. And I would say mainly for the better in terms of race and race relations. And so, what's happened there? Well, first of all, the original Greenwood, most of what was burned on June 1st, 1921, it's no longer in the domain of African Americans. The biggest part of it is now a college campus. It was taken over in the 60s and 70s through urban renewal, and then the rest of it has mainly been in the last, say, decade or so, has been developed in other ways. There's a ballpark there now, and there's some businesses and restaurants and things like that. So that's actually caused a lot of friction, and the Greenwood that existed up until around 1970 or so is basically gone, and except for one little piece of it there that's been more or less preserved. I don't see it coming back. I don't see how that can happen. Now, if you're talking about in terms of the African American community in Tulsa, it's really spread out, and there's a lot of disagreement over what direction it's going, what direction it should go. It's probably beyond my comprehension to guess what's going to happen, but I think over time you're going to continue to have areas of Tulsa that have, and some of it are in that. I mean, the area that's now thought of as North Tulsa or Greenwood or Black Tulsa or whatever. There's a lot of poverty in there, and whether that can be addressed or not. I think that's something that we've been working on for as long as I've lived in Tulsa, 40 years, and whether we get anywhere or not, I don't know. But I think you have to be careful and understand that just because the area that's identified as Greenwood has a lot of poverty, that all Black Tulsans live in poverty, because that's not the case.
Yeah, definitely. And something that I believe that you could probably speak a little bit better to, obviously that was just a little bit of speculation, is sort of when you were analyzing a lot of this stuff, right? And you were thinking about like, okay, I'm looking at what the newspapers are doing and how they were covering it. How would you assess? A lot of people think that back then maybe the newspapers were a little bit biased because of it. How would you assess the way that they covered it back then, and how did it impact the work that you did on this book?
Well, the newspapers largely reflected the communities that they served. So if we're talking about the World and the Tribune, which were the two main newspapers, daily newspapers in the city at the time, and their audience was they were mainly interested in their white audience. They were very biased in that way, and which was kind of the norm. So when I'm reading those newspapers, I have to understand that's I understand what those biases were. In some cases, it's quite obvious, they in some of the language. I would say the Tribune in particular they wanted Greenwood removed. They wanted it cleared out. Now, I want to be clear, they didn't necessarily want the Black population run out of the city, but they believed the old Greenwood needed to be reformed and moved. In other words, they wanted it moved further out of the city, or to the edge of the city. And both newspapers reflected a lot of the biases and stereotypes of that period.
Yeah, for sure, and I'm sure you find that a lot if you're doing any sort of these historical pieces, which is probably very fascinating to see that happen. And last question for you, Randy, as somebody like you said has been in Tulsa for 40 years. How have you seen, I guess, over these past 40 years and into today, sort of how Tulsa and Greenwood have meshed together? I guess if it's better, or if it's, or how has it been since you've gotten here?
Well, I think the attitude of white Tulsa towards race has changed during that time, and I think in a lot of ways it's become more understanding and in somewhat less racist. I mean, when I came here, I was a sports writer. The University of Tulsa had a black quarterback, and even though I don't know that there was a lot of overt racism directed towards him, there was a lot of sort of probably racism that was unrecognized on the part of some of their fans. In other words, what I'm thinking about is that whenever the team won, everybody loved him, and when they didn't win, there were a lot of suggestions that maybe they should give the backup quarterback, who was white and not nearly as athletic, another chance. And then, so 20 years ago, when I was covering the race riot, it was called the Race Riot Commission then. It's now sometimes referred to as the Race Massacre Commission. When I'd write stories about what happened, I'd get a lot of calls and messages and things like that from people who were unhappy that we were spending a lot of time on that subject. And so, now when we write about it, we don't get much of that at all. Now, having said all of that, there's still a lot of, sort of systemic racism, I think, in the city, and probably a lot of other cities too, and a lot of what nowadays is called implicit bias at work. People have biases that they don't really recognize. And so it's an ongoing process. People are trying to recognize where some of these relics of the past exist in our system, and are trying to root them out.
Yeah, definitely, and an ongoing process for sure. We'll see sort of how it unwinds here. Definitely in the centennial anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Randy, thank you so much for doing this, and for all your insight and for all your reporting. I sincerely appreciate it a ton.
All right, thank you.
Greenwood Here and Now is produced by the O'Colly Media Group. Thank you for listening.